Every civilization in history has faced a financial crisis at some point. Rome went bankrupt. Greece collapsed under debt. The Ottoman Empire defaulted on its loans. Even the United States has had depressions, recessions, and bank panics that wiped out millions of people overnight. But there is one civilization that lasted for over 3,000 years, and in all that time, it never had a financial crisis. No bank runs, no inflation spirals, no stock market crash, no debt defaults. 3,000 years of economic stability. The civilization was ancient Egypt, and the reason it worked has nothing to do with gold and everything to do with grain. To understand why Egypt never had a financial crisis in the first place, you first need to understand what causes financial crises in the first place. Most financial crises in history share one common thread. They happen when a system built on trust suddenly loses that trust. A bank collapses because people no longer believe their money is safe. A currency crashes because people no longer believe it holds value. A debt crisis explodes because lenders no longer believe they will be repaid. The entire modern financial system runs on confidence. And confidence, as history has shown us again and again, can evaporate overnight. Ancient Egypt solved this problem in the most elegant way possible. They built their economy on something that could never lose people's trust, because people could see it, touch it, and most importantly, eat it. They built their economy on grain. Every year, the Nile River flooded. This was not a disaster. It was a gift. The floodwaters deposited rich black silt across the farmland, making the soil some of the most fertile on earth. Egyptian farmers could grow wheat and barley in quantities that seemed almost impossible to neighboring civilizations. But here is what made Egypt unique. The pharaoh did not let farmers keep all of that grain. Every harvest, farmers paid taxes, typically between 10 and 20% of what they grew. And that grain went directly into massive government storehouses called granaries. These granaries were spread across every region of Egypt. They were not symbolic. They were not decorative. They were the engine of the entire Egyptian economy. Workers who built the pyramids were not paid in gold coins. They were paid in grain, bread, and beer, measured out from these government stores every single day. Scribes were paid in grain. Soldiers were fed from grain stores. Temple priests received grain as their salaries. Grain was not just food. Grain was money. Grain was the economy. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds simple, but why was it so stable? Here is the genius of it. When you build an economy on grain instead of money, you remove the one thing that destroys most financial systems: speculation. You cannot speculate on grain the way you can speculate on gold or paper currency. You cannot create grain out of nothing. You cannot print more grain. Grain has what economists call intrinsic value. It does not rely on government promises or market confidence. Its value is biological. Human beings need food to survive. Therefore, grain will always have value, in good times and in bad. This meant that the Egyptian economic system could not suffer the kind of panic-driven collapse that destroys modern economies. There was no equivalent of a stock market crash, because there was no stock market. There was no bank run, because there were no banks that could become insolvent. There was no inflation spiral, because the supply of grain was directly tied to actual agricultural output, not to a printing press. The most famous description of this system appears in one of the oldest stories in human history. In the book of Genesis, a young man named Joseph is brought to Egypt as a slave. He rises to become the pharaoh's top advisor, and his most important achievement is an economic policy. Joseph warned the pharaoh 7 years of abundance are coming, followed by 7 years of famine. His advice was to collect and store 20% of all grain during the good years, so that Egypt would have enough to survive the bad years. The pharaoh followed this advice, and when the famine came, Egypt was the only civilization in the region that had food. Every neighboring nation came to Egypt to buy grain. Egypt grew wealthier during a famine that was destroying everyone around it. Whether you read this story as history or as allegory, the economic logic it describes is completely accurate. Economists today call this counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It is considered one of the most sophisticated economic management techniques in modern finance. Ancient Egypt was practicing it 3,000 years ago without a single economist, without a single spreadsheet, and without a single coin.
By around 500 BC, the Egyptian grain system had evolved into something that looks remarkably familiar to a modern economist. Egyptian farmers began depositing their grain in government granaries and receiving written receipts in return. These receipts could then be used to make payments to other people. A farmer could transfer part of his grain deposit to a craftsman simply by updating the records at the granary. This was, in practical terms, a banking system, not built on gold or silver, but built on grain. By the time of the Ptolemaic rulers, there was a central granary bank in Alexandria that recorded accounts from granary banks across the entire country. Payments were transferred from one account to another through written records, almost exactly like a modern wire transfer. Historians now consider this to be the world's first functioning banking system, and it was built not on the promise of money, but on the reality of food. So, if this system was so stable and so brilliant, why did it end? The answer reveals something important about the limits of even the best economic systems. 3 things brought down the Egyptian model. First, the Persian invasion in 525 BC introduced coined money into Egypt for the first time. Once coins entered the system, they gradually replaced grain as the primary medium of exchange. And with coins came all the vulnerabilities of a money-based economy.
Second, the Roman conquest in 30 BC transformed Egypt from a self-managing civilization into a grain colony for Rome. The Romans extracted Egypt's agricultural surplus to feed the city of Rome, reversing the entire logic of the system. Instead of storing grain to protect Egyptians during famines, Egypt's grain was now being shipped out to feed a foreign empire. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Egypt lost control of its own decisions. When choices about grain were made in a foreign capital thousands of miles away, the system lost its intelligence. A centralized grain economy only works when the center understands local conditions. Rome did not.
Here is the part of this story that most people miss. The ancient Egyptian economy was not primitive. It was not simple. It was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberately designed system built around one foundational insight: that any economy built purely on trust in abstract symbols, whether gold coins, paper money, or digital numbers, is vulnerable the moment that trust collapses. Egypt's founders built their economy around something that could never become worthless, and that decision gave them 3,000 years of stability that no civilization before or since has matched. Today, in moments of genuine economic crisis, what do people rush to buy? Gold, food, essential goods, things with real, tangible value. In other words, in a crisis, people instinctively try to rebuild the Egyptian system. Every financial crisis in modern history has been, at its core, a crisis of confidence in abstract systems. Ancient Egypt solved that problem not by making the system more trustworthy, but by making it more real. That is a lesson that is 3,000 years old, and we still have not fully learned it. 3,000 years. No financial crisis. Not because Egypt was lucky. Not because nothing bad ever happened. Famines came. Wars were fought. Droughts hit. But the economic system absorbed every shock, redistributed resources, and kept functioning.
The secret was not gold. It was not military power. It was grain, stored in granaries, managed by scribes, and distributed with mathematical precision to every worker, soldier, and citizen who needed it. The world's longest-running economy was not built on money. It was built on the one thing that money is supposed to represent: real value that actually keeps people alive.